Good morning, everyone. I've got 10 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar this morning. Today's webinar topic is focusing on the idea of a stretching program and whether that is a good fit for your workplace or not. This is something that we get asked about on a semi-regular basis. It comes up in conversations with clients and conversations. We've been doing a lot of training lately, so as part of the recommendations or the solutions for the problem, getting your staff prepared to perform work is a topic of conversation that we do hear often. And I want to just review today really what the literature is telling us about stretching programs, and then most specifically some tips and tricks to think about as you go forward perhaps with implementing one of these at your workplace. So outline of what my plan for today is, and this is a hot topic webinar. This is new for us. If you've been joining our webinars for a while, we've just introduced these this year, and we've only done a couple of them so far. So traditionally, our webinars are 1 hour long. Our hot topic webinars are just meant to be quick webinars. They're 30 minutes on one very specific topic. So we just tighten up the conversation a little bit so we get really specific on what we're discussing today. So that said, our agenda for today is to talk briefly about stretching programs and the perceptions associated with those, talk about what stretching in the workplace is, recreational stretching, and then the role of ergonomic interventions here in this process and how we can use stretching programs as an ergonomic intervention. And then if you are going to move forward with a program, what are some steps and things that you need to be thinking about or addressing as you go forward? So specifically, typical goals for a stretching program that we hear most often is that it is meant to be an injury prevention practice. So when people are talking to us about doing a stretching program or developing for their work site, usually what we're talking about is injury prevention is sort of the goal or the purpose. So when you look at that and dive into that a little more, probably the key pieces that we're looking at addressing here are increasing flexibility. I think it's fairly obvious that if we're doing stretching on a regular basis, we should see increases in flexibility. That is absolutely a direct correlation between what happens when we do regular stretching. It likely increases self-perception and self-worth, so we see some value in that, and perhaps we see some physical changes connected to your flexibility. You've barely been able to bend at the waist for the last several years. You start doing a stretching program and start to see progress. There is some self-worth increases that are associated with that as well. The question really that most of our clients are trying to address is that injury rate or injury prevention element, and obviously connect that to the reduced cost of the injuries because we should experience less of them. And that's where the stretching program literature may or may not support that, depending on the way the program is built and depending on several other factors, really. It determines whether this program is likely to be successful in achieving those goals or not. And so we'll explore that a little bit more because I think the answer to both of those points is that it may do that. It also may not. And so you may invest something in a stretching program that isn't actually getting you, if your goal is reduce injury risk, then your stretching program may not do that. Right? So we want to explore that a little bit more. So the perceived benefits that we see or that we talk about is primarily that the physical, people expect the stretching program to minimize employee discomfort. So they expect to see that discomfort reduction. They expect to see some, as a correlation to that, some injury risk reduction. They expect to see some muscular performance increases. So our ability of our muscles to perform work and to certainly perform work safely is the expectation. We expect you to see muscular flexibility, so increased range of motion at different joints, mobility. Those are the kinds of things that we're expecting to get from a physical perspective when we implement regular stretching in any part of our life, really. I think that is the general expectation. And obviously, if this is a work initiative, then the workplace is expecting that, as well as likely the employees participating are expecting that as well. There are some psychological benefits as well. So some perceived psychological benefits here are increased employee morale. That is a common one that we do see. Is there is some employee morale increase here, and improved safety culture. And I think those make sense. When you think about the safety culture, a stretching program, if the perceived benefits are that it is about improving employees' ability to move better and to perhaps be stronger and to be safer while they're at work, because we're trying to warm you up so that when you're performing your physical activity, we are making sure that you are ready to do that. I think if those are the messages that staff are receiving, then that safety culture element, it helps to support that, right? That we are demonstrating in the actions that we're taking, that we are trying to improve the safety of the workplace, and people see that in a very real way. They see and participate in that. Most stretching programs we see are mandatory. So when you go in to complete a stretching program, everyone is participating. It is a very visual way to demonstrate a workplace commitment to overall employee health, essentially, if you want to think about it that way. So those are the perceived benefits or our expectations leading in. Let's take a look here at what the research is actually saying, because it isn't 100% supporting some of the perceptions or the perceived benefits of this. So first place, there have been some research that has supported that stretching in the workplace can decrease discomfort, which is a good thing. It can increase productivity, and it can increase discomfort awareness. So employees are more aware of their aches and their pains, their discomforts, and more aware of their limitations, right? So think about if you're not a regular stretcher, if I was to ask you to stretch today and you were performing a back bend, so you're bending forward trying to touch your toes, if you go to perform that movement, which is not a normal movement for you, then you are likely going to experience some discomfort. And if you have an issue with your lower back, for example, then that discomfort is likely to be there when you perform that movement. And so sometimes it creates increased awareness about what discomfort people are experiencing in their body, and they can even see individual differences sometimes between sides of your body. So when you look at people's shoulder joints, for example, they can do all kinds of different things, right? Your shoulder moves in all kinds of different ways. And sometimes what happens is you'll see a significant difference between one side of your body and the other. So what your left shoulder can do is drastically different than what your right shoulder can do, either good or bad. And so it might be a good indicator for staff that there is they might discomfort, but they also might see some of those limitations and start to think about what's causing that. Should I be concerned about that? What are the potential issues here? So it raises a lot of awareness, depending on how the stretching is done. It can raise a lot of awareness about potential discomforts and issues that individual staff members are experiencing as they work. Potentially, it might be happening outside of work as well, but certainly what they are bringing to work and what their body's limitations or abilities are. And many of us have these, many of us have this sort of unilateral issues, right? We have discomfort on one side of our body and not the other, or we have range of motion limitations on one side of our body and not the other. And so it may sort of bring that awareness forward, which could potentially lead to the pros and cons to this, right? Is that we may also learn about things that we didn't know about. So you as a workplace, you may be receiving more information about discomforts people are experiencing, more information about issues they're having, which may or may not lead to some claims. So you may find that you see a claim increase associated with an introduction of a stretching program because of this increased awareness element. It doesn't mean that you have more issues after stretching or that stretching is causing injuries, because that's not what's happening. It's likely that your staff are more aware of how their body is performing, that we don't evaluate it in that way very often. And so it'll start to be more increased awareness, often leads to increased reporting. So you may see some folks reporting injuries more frequently than they would have otherwise. The other part of this is you also, the good part, I think, about the injury reporting element, not trying to make that a deterrent. I think what you do is actually learn about injuries earlier. So there is an increased likelihood of earlier reporting of injuries if they're going to be talking to you about it. And that is a good thing. We advocate for the importance of early reporting in lots of things that we do. But ergonomic injuries in particular are way easier to manage and way more get a much better return on investment, and it's way more financially feasible to manage these injuries in the early stages. So if our staff are more aware of the discomfort and discrepancies within their body and bringing that information forward to you, it may feel like some increased reporting, but hopefully we're reporting injuries very early, where people are not taking time off work. They're probably not seeking treatment. They're not going to a chiropractor or physio at this point. So they're really self-managing any of the issues they're identifying. And so we as an employer can then have some positive opportunity for potential ergonomic change here too. So it can be that increased awareness can be actually really valuable if that's something that you are looking for in your workplace. Now, there are lots of ways to do workplace stretching programs, and this really depends on your workplace environment in particular, right? So when you look at office environments, like the picture I have up there, most often what you're going to see in an office environment is typically a software program that is going to guide staff through stretches. So there can be different types of programs here. Usually they're divided into sort of two main categories. One is like an interrupting program, so it truly interrupts the workflow. And the second one is a passive program. So an interrupting program is one that would pop up on your screen and essentially you cannot exit out of it. So you're in your workplace, you have been working on a project of some kind, this intervention pops up and reminds you that it's time to stretch and leads you through, hopefully, in addition to just reminding you it's time to stretch, leads you through several stretches to perform at your office or computer workstation. And that is of our two, there's pros and cons to that, right? You're in the middle of something pretty intensive, something pops up, reminds you to stretch. That can be really frustrating, especially if it takes you out of it for 5 or 10 minutes. Maybe you're a time crunch trying to complete a deadline or meet a deadline. And so it can be difficult to, they can be frustrating to be participating in those ones. The flip side of that is we see greater participation, that staff are more likely to participate in that kind of a program because essentially they're forced to, right? They could take that time to walk away from their workstation or do some, go photocopy or whatnot. But in most cases, what we see is when people are forced to take a step back from work, they typically participate in the activity that we're asking them to do to whatever capacity they're able. And so we see a greater adherence to the program when they get an interrupting program, an interrupting workflow type software program. A passive program would be something that pops up to remind you that you need to do stretches now, right? So you even see those on things like your Apple Watch, right? Like there's lots of watches and Apple device, or not just Apple, but lots of devices out there that will remind you it's time to sit or it's time to stand. And there's programs out there that will remind you to stretch as well. And so they will pop up on your screen and a little text box at the bottom corner remind you that it's time to do your stretching. And then you essentially have to opt in to participate or not. And the adherence rates to those programs are variable, but are significantly less than compared to a program that forcibly stops work for you for a given period of time, right? So that typically is the two pieces. So it's a software program and typically applies to an office environment. A participative program is typically what we would see more on your happening in your non-office environment. So if you have field workers, if you are talking about a manufacturer, production facility, we would see typically a stretching program happening, a participative stretching program happening in those environments. And those typically mean that it is a warm-up program and it's typically led by workers or supervisors or someone. It's a guided program, and it's meant to be done typically before work begins maybe at the beginning of the day. Occasionally we see it happen a couple times a day, so at the beginning of the day and shortly after lunch, for example, as we get started back into work. And so those programs are really guided programs. They walk you through specific stretches to perform in order to hopefully warm you up in order to perform the task at hand. And then the third option is something that we would describe as a passive program, and different than a software program, which passively reminds you to stretch. A passive program might be things like stretching posters and other things that are posted around that people can voluntarily do as they are feeling aches or pains or discomforts, or is intended to be done at the beginning of the shift, but there's nobody really guiding you or holding your feet to the fire to make sure that you do that. So there are really sort of three key differences between different stretching programs that are out there and available to you to select from. So the workplace stretching program. What we often draw from when we're looking at expectations for a workplace stretching program is looking at sort of recreational stretching. And so when we look at recreational stretching, so when you do that at the gym or in your home, at the start of the day, at the end of the day, or throughout when you're feeling uncomfortable, what we typically see, or the studies demonstrate here, is that increased flexibility is present. reduced frequency of musculoskeletal disorders or ergonomic type injuries, which can happen in all environments, decrease in pain and discomfort. And then if you connect that to the workplace, we are expecting to see decreased cost of claims, lost time for people who less lost time for people who stretch versus non-stretch. Now the question really is whether this is relevant to is this relevant? Is it going to apply to your workplace? What is this going to look like at your workplace? How do we do this? And are we going to see those same benefits? Because there's also some studies out there that have shown the opposite, that there is actually little to no change in injury frequency or severity, little to no change in discomfort, and lack of ongoing participation. So as we see attrition out of the program, or people start to, they find ways to get around participating in the program, that participation tends to go down, especially if they're not seeing any significant benefits associated with that. So it's really that progress stretching program and applying some of these recreational stretching program principles to the workplace. We've seen really mixed reviews. The literature is all over the place in terms of what we can expect in terms of physical change. They're pretty consistently, they demonstrate that there is the cognitive element, that safety culture, that workplace, the morale, feeling like my workplace is supporting me and cares about my health and well-being. That part we pretty consistently see is supported by workplace stretching programs. But if your goal is actual injury reduction, it's a bit all over the map, and it depends on a whole bunch of factors. Sometimes it depends on the population you have. Sometimes it seems to depend on what type of program you're implementing. So there's been some research out there suggesting different cultures, depending on the culture you have at your workplace. Some cultures are more focused on things, would typically not do a formal stretching program like I would picture. Their culture would probably be more likely to participate in something like Tai Chi, right? And so a Tai Chi program, they've seen success with, that's just an example of a literature I read recently, but a program like that, that is sort of more in line with what the culture would participate in potentially outside of work or is more widely accepted, can be beneficial as well. So really tailoring the program itself to your individual workplace and what staff are likely to participate in or demonstrate interest in is your best bang for your buck here. But it is really, the verdict is really out whether this is going to be super effective for you in effectively reducing injury. So that's just sort of our words of caution. So other things to think about here is that it is widely believed that increased range of motion for the back is good. So that's sort of one thing that people expect. We're going to see increased range of motion, increased flexibility. So we are expecting that that's a good thing. But there is evidence specifically for the back coming out of one of the universities here in Ontario, that there is evidence that greater range of motion in our back may actually increase our risk of future back problems, especially if we're performing work poorly. Like if you are doing, if you want increased range of motion in your back and you're doing incredibly awesome lifting techniques, then we're probably not going to see a huge increase here. But if we don't use fabulous lifting techniques and our back is able to move in more different and varied ways, we actually open ourselves up to some potential injury risk here. So it is sort of not a direct correlation that flexibility actually decreases injury risk. In some cases, it might be increasing it. And so need to be mindful of that. I think the message for me here is that this is not a standalone program, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Your stretching program needs to be one part of the system, right? If you want to, effectively manage some of these concerns, then we need to make sure we're also training and educating on safe lifting practices, for example, and probably making some other changes as well to try and minimize the weights and things that our people are handling. It's also important to note that most literature supports the idea that not everyone should necessarily participate. So, for example, people with pre-existing or previous injuries may or may not be a good fit for a stretching program, right? That this asking them to stretch those joints out may push those joints beyond what is considered a safe range of motion for their specific injury or what they're able to do. And so we need to be cautious about asking folks who have had pre-existing injuries in participating. So getting their, basically I would ensure that I get clearance from a medical practitioner here before I ask people to participate in this program would probably be good practice. If they're a general able-bodied person, a stretching program is unlikely to cause any injury, but if they have some pre-existing stuff going on, just dumping them into the stretching program may be of concern if they're pushing beyond what they're considered capable for their individual joints or issues. Other staff that may struggle with a stretching program are people who are already hypermobile. So a stretching program generally increases flexibility, but if you already have incredibly flexible joints, then increasing flexibility beyond that is not actually ideal. That it may increase or open itself up to injury risk for similar reasons as I mentioned in my first point there, right? That greater range of motion in your back as well as some other joints may be potential problems in the future. So if you're already hypermobile, trying to increase your flexibility beyond what you're already capable of doing is not necessarily ideal. Right? The other element to think about is that we want workers in some capacity to feel pain and discomfort because that triggers our body that there is a potential injury here. And there is some evidence that suggests that stretching increases our pain threshold. We learn how to push through things a little bit better because that's essentially what you're doing in a stretch, right? You stretch to the point of discomfort and then you hold that stretch for a period of time and it progressively increases the flexibility. And so it may teach our staff to work through some of that discomfort inadvertently, and we don't want to be in that position either. So they're just little things to think about how we guide and build the stretching program. So let's talk about the actual benefits. Measured benefits across just about every research study that you go through is that you're likely to see increased morale, increased safety culture, and likely increased productivity. Those are three things that you fairly consistently see in most research studies about this. The costs obviously are associated with the development of the program. The other cost that's maybe a little bit more difficult to measure depending on the work environment that you're in is that this is not something that takes 30 seconds to complete, right? Our stretching programs are likely taking us 5 to 10 minutes, and so it takes staff off the line. And so especially when we're talking about production type environments or manufacturing, it takes staff away from work, and that directly impacts productivity. If you are expected to make 5,000 widgets in a day, and I take you away from work for 10 or 15 minutes. By the time we get all organized, complete their 5 to 10 minute stretching program, get you back on the line. If we do that twice a day, now we're effectively losing 20 or 30 minutes of work time throughout the day, and that can have a significant impact on production. So it tends to increase productivity because we're feeling better and we're just in a better position to maybe perform some of that work, but we do have some decreased production because it takes you away from that work for a period of time. What's on the fence and is variable, like I said in several other research studies here, is injury reduction is sort of up in the air, and that depends on the frequency and the cost. So we don't necessarily see a decrease in number of injuries. We don't necessarily see a decrease in cost because some people think, okay, well, maybe I'll see the same number of injuries or maybe, but each injury will cost me less because my staff are more capable of recovering, for example. And so my lost time element should be shorter if I've been doing stretching programs. And that's not necessarily supported in the research. It's a bit all over the place. We have a few studies that have seen it, a few that have not. And so that severity element is not necessarily impacted here. So sometimes our injuries are just as severe even though they're participating in a stretching program. I think where I see ergonomics fitting in this process is really a couple elements. Is we need to be mindful that a stretching program is really an administrative control, right? When it comes right down to it, teaching people to stretch or warm up those muscle groups before they perform work is an administrative control. We're not effectively changing the work in any way. And if you think about your hierarchy of controls, we know that the administrative controls are lower on the priority list. It's a weaker control option. It maybe addresses some symptoms. There's some optional elements here, whether the staff are fully participating or not, or are they, even if they're going through the motions, are they actually stretching and getting the benefits of that? And there is obviously some debate about all of those things. So we know that stretching programs an administrative control option. If you're going to go forwards with the program, and I'm not trying to talk you out of that today, but if you go forwards with the stretching program, it's important that it's incorporated as part of a bigger, more grander approach to ergonomics in general, right? That we need to start with ergonomic interventions and look at what can we actually change about the workplace. If using a stretching program to effectively reduce injuries is not our best strategy. Using an ergonomic intervention so I no longer have to lift that 60-pound object, once every 5 minutes is a much better strategy. And so using that, an intervention that effectively eliminates or mitigates that risk through engineering controls or engineering changes is a much better solution than just strictly implementing an administrative control like stretching or training if it's under that category as well, right? So we want to make sure that we are combining these together. Do ergonomic changes as you are able. Try and get your workplace in the best position possible. Reduce your injury risk in every way that you can possibly do that. And then look at other interventions like a stretching program. It is not likely to be your be-all and end-all change here. If you are going to complete a stretching program, some steps to think about as you go forward are to work on getting buy-in, and this is buy-in from all levels of staff. You need to get your staff buy-in for their participation. You're also definitely going to need some buy-in from upper management because they need to give staff the time and the resources to step away from their physical, typical day-to-day job in order to have the time to complete this. Make sure you have your injury and discomfort data and know the physical demands of the jobs or the tasks. When we build a stretching program, and it's not just a one-size-fits-all system and we hand out the same program to everywhere that we go. If I build a stretching program for a workplace that has really hand and wrist-intensive activity, then my stretching program is focused around those things. So we're going to be focusing on stretching our upper limbs, essentially. And if I have a workplace that has a lot of climbing in and out of vehicles and heavy lifting and loading unload trucks, for example, probably my stretching program is more focused on the lower body and the back, which are going to be the areas that are directly impacted. So we need to understand the physical demands of our jobs or tasks and then build a program that is customized to address those specific things, right? Trying to build a program that actually is going to work on addressing the concerns that we have. And that should come back to your injury and discomfort data as well. If you have lots of shoulder injuries, we want to build a stretching program that addresses shoulder discomforts, which should match the physical requirements of your job. Every stretching program should have a bit of a warm-up and cool-down, just as you should have if you're going to go to the gym and you're going to do a workout. You should start with a bit of a warm-up and you should finish with a bit of a cool-down. And so every stretching program should have those elements included to get our body moving and warm. We shouldn't be stretching cold muscles, for example, is not the ideal stretch. We want to actually get the people moving a little bit, get them a bit warm, and then start a more static stretching program from there. And we want to be thoughtful about who you select and train as your champions. So sometimes this is supervisors that are leading the stretching program. Sometimes it's frontline staff that are particularly engaged or interested in this activity. But you can pick and choose who you think is the right fit. But it is something I would encourage you to be mindful about. Your supervisors aren't always the right choice. Your joint health and safety committee isn't always the right choice. And sometimes your frontline staff aren't. You have to figure out who the right mix of people are who will be champions of this program, encourage staff to participate, make it fun or interesting, and trying to do it that way. So you just be thoughtful of that element. I have 30 minutes and I am at 10 minutes, at just before 30 minutes right now. So I am going to open the floor up to questions at the moment. But before I do that, I just want to remind you of our next month's webinar. We are doing the topic, a new topic for us actually, is talking about how the role ergonomics can play in heat stress and injury prevention associated with that. So we are hosting that webinar on July the 25th at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And you can register online at our website, www.PROergonomics.ca. So that said, quick webinar today, 30 minutes seems like it flies by. Does anyone have any questions for me at the moment? I haven't seen any come through as we've gone. Okay, so question is coming in, skimming through it here, essentially asking what we have seen in some of the stretching programs that we've implemented in terms of injury reduction, sort of talking about the research, but also talking about the actual practicality of this. And I would say that we have also seen some mixed results. We have a couple clients that have had some success with the program and actually seeing some injury reduction, or at least if not injury reduction, they're not seeing any injury increases, and they haven't really seen necessarily a negative impact to their injury statistics. But I think just about every workplace that we work with are seeing what with stretching programs anyways, are seeing what the literature is suggesting, that culture and the morale element is always positively impacted. The actual injury intervention and whether it's actually impacting injury statistics is also out with our clients, whether it's working for some and not with others, or they've seen a minor decrease. I would say that no client that I can think of off the top of my head has seen, that I have information for, but the end result here, it has seen a drastic increase. You know, some people are seeing a 5% decrease in their injury statistics. Some may be upwards, they're closing in on 10%, maybe. But in most cases, if I have that information, we're looking at 5% or less injury reduction. So it's not a huge injury changers for most of our clients. Where they get their benefit is making actual change in the workplace. That's where they see drastic changes, but less so with the stretching program itself. And sometimes it's hard to tell, like it's a chicken and egg thing, right? So usually when we're involved, we're working with them on multiple levels, and so the stretching program is one piece of it. So sometimes separating out what the stretching program is effectively doing on its own is almost impossible. And so that's where we don't have the data for all of the workplaces that we work with, because they're seeing injury reduction, but we also made some significant change in other areas. And so that may be the area, that might be the thing that's actually causing the injury reduction, not the stretching program. So it's hard to attribute them all to specific things. Awesome. I don't see any other questions coming in. If you do have one, I will stay online for a few more minutes and answer anything that pops in. Otherwise, thank you for your attendance today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. And if you need to get a hold of me for, I do have a question coming in here. Hold on, let me pop it open. So good question. If someone gets an injury while stretching, is a WSIB injury, and it happened at the workplace, so I think the answer to that question probably is yes at this point. I don't know of any workplace we've worked with that we've had an acute injury while stretching, but I mean, it is possible that someone could be injured while performing a stretching program, and if it is part of their workplace activity and occurred at work, then it would be claim worthy, I believe. Good question. All right, everyone, you have a great afternoon. I'm still here for a few questions, but as people sign off, I will wish you good afternoon and hopefully see you at our next webinar in July.